The company itself this year is 50 years under Audi stewardship, and we have quite a number of people who celebrate their 50th work anniversary this year as well. Now, the company itself will turn 125 years old next year. So the longevity of L&JG Stickley is certainly there. So let me show you what our factory originally looked like on 300 Orchard Street in Fayetteville is where we are located. And that is what the factory looked at one point. So this would have been in about the 19-teens, 1910 is what we were looking at right here. Family was originally from the Midwest, and the father does abandon the family, which was 5 boys and 6 girls, and they relocate to Pennsylvania, where then all boys then learn the trade from their uncle. With Gus, it's pretty impressive to know that he was pulled out of school to do stonemasonry when he is only 12 years old. But I think that experience explains his and his brother's lifelong love of wood, frankly. That was a passion they all shared. Quarter sawn oak tended to be the wood of choice during this time, and that was really something driven, I think, more by the public. When Gus offered his furniture in 1900, he offered 5 different types of wood, which were mahogany and walnut, because again, we're in the Victorian era and that was popular at that time. So think of that as the transitional wood. But we also had the quarter sawn white oak, we had curly maple, we had chestnut, so we had other options as well. Quite frankly, in the museum, we have one piece out of chestnut I can show you, and I have none with the curly maple. So if you find any, please let me know. I'd like to add that to the collection one day. But quarter sawn oak became the wood of choice. And by the time L&JG opened their factory in 1902 in Fayetteville, they offered everything in quarter sawn oak with maybe just a few pieces of mahogany. So in that short time, it was the public had really driven the desire to see quarter sawn white oak. Now, what is quarter sawn white oak? So in the United States, we have red oak and we have white oak. White oak is the stronger of the woods. And when you cut any, and this is what this really design is showing us, is when you cut any wood on the quarter, not flat sawn, which is like the way the tree grows, you're cutting against the grain. And when you do that, you're actually creating a board that is more stable and less likely to warp or twist. In addition, with the oak, you are showing this wonderful pattern, which we call ray flake. And what the ray flake technically is the medullary rays, which bring water from the roots throughout the tree. You are exposing them. And that's that beautiful pattern we see in white oak. Now, any of you who have come to the museum, you know what my favorite piece is over there, at the top of the list, and I think I have a picture in here today. But this explains what that white oak is, and when Stickley makes furniture today, the Mission Oak collection, of course, they are using quarter sawn white oak as well. They also, a cherry line later, but oak is true to the period. So, tenons. So with this period in the arts and crafts movement, for Gus as well as Leopold, now you have to remember the brothers did work together and they did work apart. There's certainly a lot of overlap. Leopold was Gus's foreman for a number of years, so I mean there had to be some rubbing off on one another. So with the arts and crafts period in 1900, as a reaction to that Victorian era, it was honesty of materials and honesty of construction. That really is boiling it down to it. So the oak being this beautifully patterned wood, and the construction features visible and how these pieces are made are key. The furniture, other than Harvey Ellis, really does not have that decoration. You might find beauty certainly in the hinges, in the hardware, in the wood grain itself, the form obviously. But when we're looking at this too, we are also paying attention to the joinery. And this is a tenon, so this is an example of one of those types of joints. We also talk about the key tenons, and you saw several on these that Dave had shown us in the previous presentation on what is a key tenon. So in this case, the top goes through the side, and it is locked in place. Technically, you could take it apart by pulling out those keys. So they are functional joinery. Tongue and groove joinery, this is another way how they would put together, say, a tabletop. They also use splining, which was a little earlier. Again, these techniques also help us date a piece of furniture. But it creates this very strong joint. When you think of a table surface, especially some of these library tables I have, for instance, at the museum, they're quite heavy. Those tops are heavy. If you think they're probably 2 inches thick, that has to stay together, obviously. So this is a good way to do that. the quadrilinear post. This is a different method of construction featured by LNJG that Gustav did not use. I always call Gus my philosopher of this period, this movement, whereas LNJG, Leopold's my production guy, right? He is working on ways to make that construction better, and the quadrilinear post is one of it. So if I can hopefully have a top view, hold on, I'll get to the top view. If you can look at the top here, I'll kind of basically tell you this. So the quadrilinear post is a post, and instead of being a solid piece of wood, so if you would have say a white oak piece, quarter-sawn white oak piece of wood, by its nature, two sawns would have that ray flake, two saws would be flat sawn. It's the nature of the cut. So often they would be veneered because you wanted that beautiful ray flake all the way around. So that was common. Unfortunately, we always want to say solid wood is better, but that post can still expand and contract and warp and twist. And Leopold saw this. So then comes the quadrilinear post, and this is something he starts using in his own collection. So we have actually 5 pieces of oak, and what we have is a center in which 4 pieces of solid white oak are glued around that center. So think of it like a puzzle, and they're locking itself together so that wood cannot expand or contract or twist or warp. And you also now have this beautiful ray flake all the way around without having to use veneer. So this is a method that we see in LNJG pieces. I'm happy to show them to you. And when you come to the museum, if you look closely, I think I have a picture in here, you can actually see it in the piece. This is one of my favorite images of our factory. This is very early on. You'll actually notice the oldest pieces of our building date to the 1850s, and that is what we now call the East Wing, and the back south part of, and my little workshop's back here. When Leopold, and look at all the lumber. And over here, which is an apartment complex today, that's where they used to just let it air dry once upon a time. So you get to see how much we've changed over the years. But the site initially was a lumber yard, and then became a small furniture factory. And then when Leopold and John George purchased the property, they really did expand upon it, up that production, and added a wing, knitted it all together. So you will see it looks more like that earlier image that I showed you, which is more familiar if you were to visit us today. This is an example of our collection. I'll just start with arts and crafts, and I kind of want to stay there. If we look at the collection, we present Gustav on this side, and we present LNJG on this side. And when we go through that period, you can compare and contrast the brothers and their styles. So you can kind of get an idea of what's going on and how each contributed. For instance, this particular piece is a bridal chest, and it's the only piece I happen to have in chestnut. This particular piece, the bed, the vanity, and this small chest, that was Gus's bedroom suite. So it's something he personally had. And we see the Harvey Ellis inlay featured on these pieces. So again, something different to look at. This drawer here, Gus stripped that and never bothered to refinish it. So he often tinkered with finishes. Normally it was the underside of a door or drawer. The fact that he did that on the front of the drawer is very unusual. But it is something I like to point out when people visit because it's such an odd thing. You don't think that he would have done that to his own furniture, but he did. He was an experimenter. On this side we have some LNJG pieces that really today we call it the Orchard Street Rocker. It went into reproduction for a number of years, and it happened to be one of LNJG's most popular rockers. When people see that, they're like, oh, we had one of those. It's a very common form. People often recognize it as an LNJG piece. When we look at construction, I know it might be difficult, but this is that library table I mentioned and how thick that top is. And if you look at the tenons on this, they are quite large as compared to what we saw earlier. And it's not necessarily they have to be that size, but the importance about it, it's the scale. If they were small, I would think it would look awkward. It would look like it's not quite right. They are oversized because that table is oversized. And the beauty of the arts and crafts movement, the simplicity of it is that it is all about the proportion and it is all about the scale. And when that scale or proportion is off, that's when people say it looks clunky or awkward. And that's, you know, when I want to put up my hands. Because you have some beautifully designed pieces and they're certainly well thought out. And it's the ease of it that is so deceptive. I'm starting at the very beginning, so this would have been when LNJG opened the factory. They actually did with a loan from Gus, believe it or not. They weren't in competition with him at that point. So Gustav had been doing contract work, and he wanted to get out of that contract to focus on his new designs, which were mission, arts and crafts style. So LNJG took that contract, and for them it was pretty smart. They were able to get their factory up and running, pay Gustav back for that loan they took to get that factory, and within a few years they were making their own designs. So what we see here on this particular piece, this is a chair from Onondaga shops. You would say, well, geez, that really looks like a Gustav, and it really does. It was one of those contract pieces he was creating, and they took that contract, so they had to finish those orders, and of course consistency is key, right? This is a factory. They have to make them like that. But the piece next to it is a favorite, and I love this. I have a lot of favorites. But this clipped corner table is mahogany. It's a very early piece. And they were experimenting with design. And in English and Scottish arts and crafts, we see that inlay and we see that carving. And this is that what we call a leaf carving that is found on the legs here. It's a prototype. I only have one. That's it. And we have seen catalogs for LNJG with similar leaf carving, but not this design. And in fact, in storage, I have a chair with the back slats where the leaf was being carved and it was incomplete, because basically they're saying, no, nobody wants that. Stop what you're doing. Keep them plain. So they never completed that because that was too decorative. So that why it remains a prototype and never went into production. This is that quadrilinear post I mentioned. So this is oops, let me go back. Oopsies, exactly. I'm going to give you all of my show at once. So that's that quadrilinear post. It's a simplified version, but you see there's the 4 solid pieces of wood kind of glued around that central core. This recliner has it. So when we look at that, we can actually see that central square up at the top there. This is a mortise and tenon joint. It's shaped to go through the arm, and I can look right down on the top of it and see that central square. This particular chair was 1910, probably later. David had showed you Gus's bowed arm Morris chair, which was very early. So put those back kind of in your mind for a second and look at this. Construction-wise, LNJG, of course, did things differently. So right here we have that bar somebody mentioned prior. And that's how you would move the back of this chair, by moving that bar. Gus was using that peg system. Honestly, I think it's easier to replace a peg than if you were to break that bar. And here you have a spring seat. Spring seat construction comes into our furniture really thanks to the automobile industry. You know, early cars didn't have shocks and struts, so they put springs in the seats of the cars to take that bounce. Somebody had the bright idea to put that in their living room furniture, and we still do today. So that's an interesting thing, and for us, that helps us date an object, you know, if it's earlier or later, if it has that construction. So that's one of the things we look for when we're looking to identify a piece in a maker. And here, this is, if you can see, this is that central square coming up through that post. You have to look carefully, but it is certainly there. And to be honest, it is very difficult to look at the leg of that post and try to find those seams. I'm just curious, does anybody have any LNJG pieces at home? Okay. Do you have something with a quadrilinear post? Okay. Does it? Take a good look at it. Let me know if you can find it. And if you visit me at the museum, we'll sit down with a flashlight and we'll really look close. Because it's a thrill to try to look at these things and identify them closely. This table is called the 713. And one of the things about LNJG I like to mention is the design. Their design, as Gus's, really does transcend the ages. When we think of the mission period of furniture in the United States, it was really only popular for about 15 years. And folks, that's not a long time. So through time and history, we really could have lost all of these pieces and lost the names of the designers. When the company decided to reissue these designs, and I'll give you some more background about LNJG, when Gustav went bankrupt, that's when all the brothers came together to form a brief company called Stickley Associated Cabinet Makers. So whatever consternation or competition they had, they were still family, and they helped Gus through that difficult time. Unfortunately, it was short-lived. It did not last too long. But when the company reissued these designs in 1989, they used a combination of both LNJG pieces and Gustav pieces. That's the heart of our collection. Those two companies merged, and we have most of those designs in our archives. Well, the 713 table is one of them. This particular table was one of LNJG's most popular dining tables, and the factory started making this again in 1989. They still make it, and believe it or not, because I wanted to confirm this before I came here today, it is still in the top 10 of the dining room tables that Stickley sells today, which is, to me, phenomenal. That's just great design, right? I mean, we've been reissuing that table since 1989, and it's still sought after. So that speaks a lot about this particular table.
Does it take leaves?
It does. It does. From what I understand, they could put up to 8 leaves in it in their time. I don't know how they did that, but they could. And this is an example of the 713. It's probably the only object I know by number. This is from one of the catalogs at that time, the 713.
So that one doesn't even have a line?
Nope. So I don't know if it was the catalog or not. This settle you'll see here, these 3 pieces give you a little of the provenance. The settle, the plant stand, and the screen were once part of Barbara Streisand's collection. They came to the museum through auction. The settle truly is my favorite piece in the collection. It's a Peter Hansen design for LNJG. Peter Hansen is the only designer to work for both Gustav and LNJG. This particular piece, pink mohair was her choice, so we won't change it. That's part of the provenance now of this settle, so we wouldn't alter that at all. But what makes this piece a favorite, other than the designer, is that when you look at it, and I should have another shot here, you have the ray flake, this beautiful grain pattern, is actually seen all around this piece, the front, the back, the top, the sides. This is one of the side panels. You can actually see that. That grain pattern is just, again, you have that wonderful line. And to me, it's not just the designer. It tells me that the people who made this piece, we're talking about the craftsmen now, they were very careful about the boards they chose to get that grain pattern on the top, on the back, on the sides, on the front. And that's a feature to me of this particular settle. And it does remain one of my favorites because, again, it's not just the design we're talking about. It's the people who made it and their eye and matching all of this and getting it together. That's why it remains one of my favorite pieces. We see that settle again. These are images from our archives, actually. And I'm doing a lot of work in our archives now, so I'm finding a bunch of wonderful goodies, and you can talk to me about that later. But again, so these are Peter Hansen's designs. So he is introducing the spindle style here, and we see that in these pieces with the long corbel, which is an LNJG, a stylistic difference. Here's that prairie settle again, we see, and the cube chair. So these are designs we see 1910, 1912. And so when Mission is evolving, we see a horizontal. It goes to a vertical with that spindle style. It lightens it up again. But yet, with this, we call them prairie style, influenced of also Frank Lloyd Wright, they have this low horizontal now. And that's what we see in these pieces here, that low line. This is our factory. If you were to come up today, you'd see our sign right outside of our building. We look a little different. The building has had a lot of work to it. And this is the front entrance. If you were to ever come by and visit, please do. The museum is open on Tuesdays and Saturdays and by appointment. In the summer hours, we add Fridays to this, but I'm always happy to show off the collection. So if you have my contact information on the brochure, please call me. Yeah, I always say if I can't show it off, what's the point, right? So I will certainly do that.